Thank you so much, Marjorie, for agreeing to do this talk for us. It's just an immense honor. I am not going to introduce you because everybody knows who you are, the work you have done, and the work you are still doing, amazingly enough. Thank you for your latest book, The Infrathin, but also for the notebooks and collection of reviews, book reviews that are coming out from you. It's a great source of inspiration. In the Infrathin, there is a chapter on Eliot. So today, it's great you can link him to Pound. The title of your keynote lecture is Eliot's Pound Moment, Citationality in the Wasteland. And I think we all want to hear you and not me. So please, whenever.
Thank you. Thank you, Helene. I'm thrilled to be here. I wish I were in the real Paris. Would be even nicer, wouldn't it? But here I am. Okay. And I'm going to show slides in a minute. I'll have the poems on slides. And if I go too fast, speak too fast, just tell me, because I sometimes do. The Wasteland is, as everyone knows, a collage of allusions to texts in other languages, ranging from Greek and Latin to German, French, Italian, and even Sanskrit in the poem's dramatic conclusion. But although the main allusions have long been identified and their thematic import endlessly explicated and discussed, there's one question that has been oddly slighted. When and why does Eliot cite a line or passage in the original language, and when does he translate it? Line 307, for example, the famous line, "To Carthage then I came," is footnoted by Eliot himself in his notes as referring to St. Augustine's Confessions. "To Carthage then I came, where a cauldron of unholy loves sang all about mine ears." Now, in Latin, the sentence from Book 3, Chapter 1 reads, "Veni Carthaginem et circumstribebat me undique sartago flagitisorum amorum." Now, why did Eliot render Augustine's famous opening words in English when in line 431, he reproduces the reference to Arnaud Daniel in Dante's Purgatorio, "Poi s'aspose nel fuoco che li affina"? Then he dived into the refining fire in the original Italian. The Wasteland, the poem Ezra Pound so remarkably edited, indeed transformed, bears everywhere the sign of Pound's uncanny conciseness, as when, and I love this one, when Lil's husband was coming back out of the transport corps, which Pound changed to when Lil's husband got demobbed in a game of chess. So you move from 11 lines to 5, 11 words to 5. Quite a change, right? And you don't need all that, was coming back out of the transport corps. Surely the great multilingual poet of his age, Pound constructs his text to the cantos from dozens of cited lines and passages, evoking the historical and literary past. Here, for example, is the final page of Canto 84, the concluding canto of the Pisen sequence. And I'm going to show you this. I'm going to move into share screen now, if we can. Yeah. See it?
Yep. Perfect.
Is that okay?
Yes. Yes, it is.
Okay, so this is a sample canto, the typical Pound, just to remind those of you who may not remember your Pound that well. "Whereto we may pay our homage," saith Micah, "each in the name of," so that looking at the sputtering tank of nicotine and stale whiskey on its way out, Cumrad Koba, that's Stalin, remarked, "I will believe the American." Berlin, 1945, the last appearance of Winston PM in that connection. E poi io dissi alla sorella della pastorella dei suini, e questi americani so conducono bene? Ed ella, poco, poco, poco. Ed io, peggio dei tedeschi? Ed ella, uguale. Through the barbed wire, you can, said Lincoln Steffens, do nothing with revolutionaries until they are at the end of their tether. And that Vandenberg has read Stalin, or Stalin John Adams, is at the mildest unproven. And then the closing couplet, if the hoarfrost grip thy tent, thou will give thanks when night is spent. Canto 84. Wait a minute. Now, here Pound's collage recreates the post-war moment. I'll go back a minute to the earlier part. When Pound was arrested and taken to the prison camp in Pisa, the mood is part serious, part jokey. First, the prophet Micah, known for rebuking his people for their greed. Next, we're on the road to Pisa, maybe, where a sputtering tank of nicotine and stale whiskey is on the way out. And the scene then shifts to a Stalin, known as Comrade Koba, cynically pretending to accommodate the Americans in Berlin in 1945. Stalin was, of course, going to do what he wanted, but pretends here to go along with the Americans. And Winston Churchill, Pound considers, is on the way out. Pound really didn't like Churchill. Someone in the crowd speaking Italian asks the swineherd sister in the crowd whether the American troops are behaving decently. She replies with a single word, poco. Only a little, evidently. And even worse than the the Germans, her interlocutor asks. And she says, the usual, uguale, through the barbed wire. And then Pound folds in a citation from Lincoln Steffens and speculates that a conservative general like Vandenberg, Hoyt Vandenberg, minor figure really, would never have read Stalin, even as the latter would not have known John Adams. And the canto ends with the moving couplet about the cold at the prison camp at Pisa. If the hoarfrost grip thy tent, thou wilt give thanks when night is spent. So ends the last of the Peace and Cantos, resonating with an echo of Elizabethan verse, the couplet. And Pound does that kind of thing all the time. Now, Eliot's Wasteland tends to be much more thematic than Pound's words. Words and phrases are chosen with an eye to their place in the whole. Consequently, the poet is not given to including such minor historical figures as General Vandenberg. But interestingly, the Hebrew prophets are central to both poets. And as for dialogue, here's the hotel room scene near the very beginning of The Wasteland. I'm sure you know it well, but let's look at that for the character of the way it's written, the way the collage works. Summer surprised us, coming over the Starnberger See with a shower of rain. We stopped in the colonnade and went on in sunlight into the Hofgarten and drank coffee and talked for an hour. Bin gar keine Russin, stamm aus Litauen, echt Deutsch. And when we were children, staying at the Archduke's, my cousins, he took me out on a sled and I was frightened. He said, Marie, Marie, hold on tight. And down we went. In the mountains, there you feel free. I read much of the night and go south in the winter. Now, this, Eliot's first compound portrait in The Burial of the Dead, is a brilliant amalgam of overheard conversation and allusions to the Countess Marie Larich's memoir, My Past of 1913. Eliot tells us that himself. Larich was a cousin of Ludwig II of Bavaria and evidently the confidant of the Austrian Crown Prince Rudolf, famous for Meyerling, who committed the double suicide with his mistress, Marie Vetzera. The Hofgarten chit-chat between upper-class socialites who have come in out of the rain, notice, come in out of the life-giving rain in the wasteland, which is always symbolic for Eliot, to drink coffee, foregrounds the words of the anonymous society woman who says, Bin gar keine Russin, stamm aus Litauen, echt Deutsch. The lady protests that she is not Russian. And don't forget, at the time, Russia was a country whose population was considered wild and barbaric by Western Europeans of the World War I years, especially after the 1917 revolution. Her admission that she is Lithuanian makes her suspect. Lithuania had a large Jewish population at the time, and she is, in any case, déclassée, since however much she protested she's echt Deutsch, she's obviously not echt Deutsch, otherwise she wouldn't have to protest it in that way. So the German line encapsulates the anomie and deracinated quality of international cafe society as Eliot saw it. The mood could not be evoked as effectively in English. The Mongolization of Europe was, we know, one of Eliot's obsessions. And today we would say a racist one, certainly. And even Marie, the genuine aristocrat, is characterized by a free-floating fear that neither a resort in the mountains nor a spa in Italy or southern France can alleviate. So, of course, as I say, this is much more thematic. It isn't like Eliot sort of throwing those names like Vanderburg around a little bit and creating a general mood, but not worrying so much about each word. In Eliot, each word always counts. And it's a different kind of collage because it is much more centered than Pound's is, and yet he obviously got the idea from Pound, the way you could interlard conversation and elements from the book and all these different things. It's interesting that when Pound was going through Eliot's manuscript, he didn't delete a single one of Eliot's foreign language passages. Indeed, the ending of part 5, What the Thunder Said, whose last 7 lines contain a bewildering sequence of colliding fragments, beginning with the Poisascose I already cited, followed by lines from the Per Vigilium Veneris, then Gerard de Nerval's sonnet El Desquitado, Thomas Kidd's The Spanish Tragedy, and finally the Brihadaranyaka Upanishad was left entirely intact. Pound especially admired the La Pia sequence in the Fire Sermon, lines 291 to 4, a passage based on striking lines in Dante's Purgatorio. So let me go on to the next here. So these are the lines, and they come up again and again in Eliot. Ricordati di me che son la pia, siena mi fe di fecemi marema, salsi colui che nell'alta pria, disponendo m'avea con la sua gemma. In English, remember me who am la pia, Siena me made me, Maremma, these are 2 towns in center of Italy, unmade me. He knoweth it who has encircled first, espousing me, my finger with his gem, evidently his ring, who put his ring on her finger and married her, and that was her disaster for La Pia. Now, Eliot's response to La Pia's story is very serious and straightforward, whereas what's probably its immediate source, Pound's Hugh Selwyn Moberly, 1920, which Eliot obviously knew, used the Inferno's line, Siena mi fe, di fecemi maremma, satirically as the title of a brilliantly satiric poem about a litterateur out of step with his decade named Mr. Virag, Pound called him, who is recalling the drunken antics of Ernest Dowson and his friends as emblematic of the decline of poetry in the yellow 90s. Pound curiously emptied the Italian line of its original reference to sexual passion and uses the words of La Pia for comic and ironic purposes, like, oh, you want to see something really ridiculous? Siena mi fe, di fecemi, Maremma unmade me. Pound gets rid of the sexual content and makes it a story about literary critics and what goes on in the poetry world. And it's interesting, by the way, that Pound does that very often. You would think he were a sexy writer, but in a funny way he isn't. And he will empty them from that kind of thing and turn it into something funny. And for Eliot, it wasn't funny at all. He took the lines very seriously, and related La Pia to the two anonymous daughters of the Thames, you remember, with all three representing the larger degradation of society in the modern wasteland of non-believers. So here, below here, is Eliot's first draft. He made 4 drafts, which wholly lacked the concision of either Dante or Pound. Highbury bore me, so he took 2 towns in England that he thought were comparable to Siena and Maremma. Highbury bore me. Highbury's children played under green trees and in the dusty park. Mine were humble people and conservative, as neither the rich nor the working class know. My father had a small business somewhere in the city, the house in Highbury, and 3 weeks at Shankin Boneyard. And I looked up those names. That was sort of, what shall I say, amusement parks. Shankin Boneyard, they had bus rides, and they had lakes, and they had entertainment for children, but at a sort of lower middle class level that Eliot himself, of course, didn't particularly approve of, right? We know. Okay. So now here comes the second, let's see. Yeah, those lines are crossed out and a second draft is made. Highbury bore me. Highbury children played under green trees and in the dusty park. Mine were humble people and conservative. And same thing again, my father had a small business. The house in Highbury, and 3 weeks at Shankin Boneyard, my knees stretched and then on the floor of a perilous canoe. And so he's bringing in the kind of almost rape element here. And excuse me, wait a minute, went too far. Yeah. That was that version. And to that version, Pound responds, okay. He wasn't very critical of this, but Eliot tried again anyway. He kept trying. Trams and dusty trees, Highbury bore me. Richmond and Kew undid me. By Richmond I raised my knees, stretched on the floor of a narrow canoe. And to that, Pound put in the right margin, echt. Echt in German, meaning the real thing. Echt, the real thing. Now, why? Why do you suppose that was? Well, it's much more concise. Trams and dusty trees, Highbury bore me. Richmond and Kew undid me. And by Richmond, I raised my knees. So there's the whole sex element, and also always the suggestion here that La Pia she was raped, more or less. We would today call it a rape, I suppose. In any case, so echt, Pound called that echt. And even more intriguing verbal transformation occurs in the Unreal City passage of part 1. Eliot's own notes refer to the famous opening words, Unreal City, Baudelaire's Fourmillante Cité, Cité pleine de rêves, in Les Éveillards, but the French poet's fourmillante, swarming, bustling city, which is almost realistic compared to Eliot's phantasmagoria. The latter continues with another Dantean allusion, his own note acknowledging the debt to 2 tercets from the depiction in Limbo in Inferno 3, lines 55-7, and Canto 4, 25-27, almost 25-30. And these are famous lines, and Eliot uses them in various places, but he took them very seriously, apart from Dante. E dietro le venia si lunga tratta di gente che io non avrai mai creduto, che morte tanta n'avesse disfatta. And behind it came so long a train of people that I should never have believed death had undone so many. And that's followed by the lines, quivi secondo che per ascoltare non avea pianto, ma che di sospiri che l'aura eterna faceva tremare. Here there's no plaint that could be heard, except of sighs which caused the eternal air to tremble. And those lines are then connected to the familiar and poignant triplet that has already occurred. Under the brown fog of a winter dawn, a crowd flowed over London Bridge, so many. I had not thought death had undone so many. Eliot's terse rendition, I had not thought death had undone so many, is rendered more powerful by the caesura and repetition emphasizing so many, and Dante's sighs, which cause the eternal air to tremble, becomes more intimately sighs short and infrequent were exhaled, and each man fixed his eyes before his feet, flowed up the hill and down King William Street. So here, what Eliot does is he makes it, and he makes it more specific. And Eliot has a way of doing that. Eliot's great forte, in a way you could say, is always this amazing specificity. Wait, let me go back here. Yeah. Okay. That few poets have achieved, and it's different again. If Pound is very concise and also very specific, but conciseness is much more important than it is for Eliot. And Eliot can sometimes sort of, what should we say, bullshit. I mean, go on and on, whereas Pound doesn't do that, is more, in a way, trustworthy in that way. Such syncretic adaptation was Eliot's characteristic mode. His mind almost intuitively created the necessary variation on his chosen topics, be it Baudelaire's City or Dante's Limbo or Augustine's Unholy Lusts. All the more reason foreign citations had to be selected with special care, as was the case with the Wasteland's wide-ranging epigraph. Ironically, a second choice, Eliot's original choice, came from Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness, where the narrator Marlowe relays the dying words of the ill-fated colonial trader, Mr. Kurtz, who is understood by Marlowe to have lost his soul. Did he live his life again? Every detail of desire, temptation, and surrender during that supreme moment of complete knowledge? He cried in a whisper at some image, at some vision. He cried out twice, cry that was no more than a breath, the horror, the horror. Now, Pound, editing Eliot's first draft, and always more conscious of the who than the what in poetry, objected to this epigraph on the grounds that I doubt if Conrad is weighty enough to stand the citation. Today, the objection may strike us as ironically off base, given the great fame of Heart of Darkness. It's become one of the most famous books, used to be read in every course, I guess now not because of the tinge of racism and so forth, but it was very, very popular book. And of course, the horror in Heart of Darkness does go very much with the horror of the Wasteland. So it was a good choice for an epigraph, but Pound didn't like it. And Eliot did not contest Pound's view and chose instead the passage in chapter 48 of Petronius's late first century Menippean satire in the Satyricon, in which the vulgar and ostentatiously rich Trimalchio, boasting of his adventures, declares, and you have it right here, nam sibilum quidam cumus ego ipse oculis meas vidi in ampulla pendere, et cum illi pueri dicerent, sibilat titheles respondebat illa apothanein thela. I saw with my own eyes the Sibyl at Cumae hanging in a cage. And when the boy said to her, Sibyl, what do you want? She answered, I want to die. Now, the Cumaean Sibyl, I'm sure, was the famous prophetess, painted, by the way, by both Raphael and Michelangelo, who asked Apollo for immortal life, but according to Ovid, forgot to ask for eternal youth, and hence withered away, her body growing smaller and smaller with age, and finally kept in a jar. Her story is very appropriate for the wasteland, whose inhabitants are the living dead. Eliot, moreover, clearly admired the contrast between Trimalchio's colloquial Latin and the Sibyl's more formal Greek. I mean, the idea that you have the Greek pasted in here, Sibyl Titheles, makes it quite unusual in that way. the Sibyl's more formal Greek. The contrast between the two, again, foreshadows the mongrelized language of the wasteland, where one speech register quickly morphs into another, emphasizing the complex history and geography incorporated into Eliot's collage poem. Then too, in Virgil's Aeneid, book 6, the Cumaean Sibyl prophesied the destruction of Rome, a note of doom that fittingly introduces the poem. So that is actually a very useful epigraph and works very well, and especially the layering of the languages. In English translation, the effect of the Latin-Greek contrast is, of course, lost. You know, they're both translated. I saw with my own eyes the Sibyl at Cumae hanging in a cage. And when the boy said to her, Sibyl, what do you want? She answered, I want to die. You can't quite get that in the English, but it does imaginatively set the stage for the image of the dead land where memory and desire motivate the action. The German line, Bin gar keine Russin, stamm aus Litauen, echt Deutsch, which I discussed above, points us to what Eliot took to be, again, the anomie, the deracinated quality of cafe society of the period. Indeed, the mongrelization was one of Eliot's obsessions. The German citations from Wagner that come next nicely fit in here in the context. The fear in the handful of dust that has been running through the poem from the beginning gives way for a moment to a note of hope. Wait a second. Yeah. So that's the song of the young sailor that opens Wagner's Tristan und Isolde. Frisch weht der Wind, der Heimat zu. Mein irisch Kind, wo weilest du? Fresh blows the wind toward home. My Irish child, where are you loitering? So that's the song of the sailor, remember? An opera Eliot evidently first came to know through his beloved Jean Verdinal, who I take to be always the object of Pounds. Love in this period in 1911, Paris. The opera opens with Tristan bringing the Irish Princess Isolde to Cornwall to be married to Tristan's uncle, King Mark, a journey that will culminate in Tristan and Isolde's drinking of the love potion that induces their oath of undying love and hence death. The Tristan lines nicely introduce later the Hyacinth Girl passage, the one moment in the wasteland where love seems possible, looking into the air, looking into the heart of light, the silence. But after those words, there's a sharp break, followed by the single German line, öd und leer das Meer, desolate and empty the sea, spoken by the watchman in Act 3 of Tristan, warning the dying lover, who is back at his ancestral castle in Brittany, that the ship bringing Isolde, for whom is anxiously waiting, is nowhere in sight. Öd und leer das Meer. I'm sorry, I didn't write that out. So in the wasteland, the Hyacinth moment, the awful daring of a moment's surrender, which an age of prudence can never retract, ends in desolation and emptiness. Now, is the retention of the German original here more than an exoticism? People have complained about that. I mean, why do we really need that? And in German, yeah, I think so, because in English, desolate and empty the sea, or fresh blows the wind, would not be nearly as dramatic or evocative as it is in this passage. And the minimalism of the lines looks ahead to Verlaine's related treatment of Parsifal in the Fire Sermon, where the hellish scene of the second verse paragraph, culminating in the bawdy ballad, oh, the moon shone bright on Mrs. Porter and on her daughter, they washed their feet in soda water, gives way to the momentary vision of spiritual beauty in Et oh, ces voix d'enfants chantant dans la coupole. And oh, those voices of children singing in the church dome. Sound, of course, also plays a role in all these instances. Öd und leer das Meer, with its internal rhyme and three stresses on long open vowels, deftly conveys the loss of love, contrasting with the jaunty dance rhythms of Frisch weht der Wind, the Heimat zu. Right above it. Indeed, so effective are the soundscapes of these passages that we sometimes forget to ask what is not translated. I want to conclude with that. What is not translated in the wasteland? So much is translated. Anyway, what with all the French and German and Italian, Latin and Greek, and even Sanskrit, as in the poem's famous conclusion, Shanti, Shanti, Shanti. What about the Hebrew prophets, so prominent in the poem, but always in English? Here, for example, is the second verse paragraph of the burial of the dead, which draws heavily on the Hebrew prophets, and I've italicized the passages that are most obviously from Ezekiel or Ecclesiastes and so on. What are the roots that clutch? What branches grow out of this stony rubbish? Son of man, you cannot say or guess, for you know only a heap of broken images where the sun beats and the dead tree gives no shelter, the cricket no relief, and the dry stone no sound of water. Only there's shadow under this red rock. Come in under the shadow of this red rock, and I will show you something different from either your shadow at morning striding behind you or your shadow at evening rising to meet you. I will show you, it should be you, my fear in a handful of dust. In his notes, Eliot himself refers us to Ezekiel 2:1-5 and 6:4 as, you know, with one of the source here of the wasteland, and further notes like I just copied a lot out for you here to see. Ezekiel 6:4, Ezekiel 12:5, where you have the almond tree and the grasshopper shall be a burden. Famous lines, and desire shall fail, because man goeth to his long home, and the mourners go about the streets. And then Isaiah 2:1, 2:10, enter into the rock and hide in the dust from the terror of the Lord and of his majesty. And Isaiah 32:3, which is, and a man shall be a hiding place from the wind and a covert from the tempest, as rivers of water in a dry place, as the shadow of a great rock in a weary land. Now, biblical imagery of this sort runs through the wasteland, but what is important to note in the context of the Latin epigraph and the Sanskrit ending is the total absence of that other ancient language, Hebrew. The prophets and Ecclesiastes could, after all, be quoted from the Hebrew Bible, where they originate rather than from the King James Version. But for Eliot, I don't know how this works in French quite, we can talk about that. But for Eliot, such an idea would have seemed preposterous. Certainly Hebrew was taught at Harvard and Oxford during Eliot's tenure at these universities, but it was a subject for biblical scholars, not liberal arts students, much less gentlemen. Sanskrit was exotic and romantic. One was pleased to dabble in Indian thought, as long as the Indian question was ancient, not modern. But the Old Testament was somehow regarded by educated Anglophone speakers of Eliot's day as the domain of the King James Bible. Of course, one cited one's Isaiah or Ezekiel from the KJV. It was as if the prophets had spoken in English. They were like English students, I guess. Now, Robert Alter, who has over the last decade produced a monumental and highly praised translation of the entire Hebrew Bible, argues in a little book called The Art of Biblical Poetry that Old Testament Hebrew was rich in puns, double entendres, complex metaphors, and sonic play, especially in the Song of Solomon and the Book of Prophets. And yet the Eliot who does cite the Upanishads would not have dreamt of trying to track down the original language or wording of his biblical citations. To put it another way, pois casas cose nel fuoco che li affina may be cited in the original Italian, but the words of the prophets remain the property of Renaissance England. A century later, now that Hebrew is widely studied, this telling omission will surely raise eyebrows. It's interesting. When I was at Oxford a few years ago, I was in a residency there, and I think I was at New College, and they said they were going to introduce me to a leading religious scholar, one of the leading religious scholars, sort of an elderly man. And so I asked him, I said, I'm curious to know Why is it taken as a given that anything Hebrew, saying Eliot, be translated from the King James Bible, never from the original? And he practically had a fit. He said, but that's the King James Bible. That is our important book. Of course, it's going to be quoted from that. We wouldn't dream of otherwise. Well, you can think about that a little bit. And the mention of Dante's Italian brings me back to the poem's dedication, which I have not yet considered, for Ezra Pound, Il Miglior Fabbro, the famous dedication, the better craftsman. Arnaud Daniel, the Provençal troubadour poet, seen in Purgatorio 26 as submitting to the refining fires of purgatory so as to purge himself of sexual lust, was one of Dante's favorite poets. He praises Arnaud for being il miglior fabbro del parlar materno, of the mother tongue. In this case, the vernacular rather than the Latin, which was still the literary language of his day. But in this context, Eliot's comparison of Pound to Arnaud is not entirely complimentary. Dante, everyone would agree, being a much greater poet than Arnaud. For Eliot to use Dante's phrase in praising Pound is, in fact, to compare himself to Dante, and many of Eliot's readers would agree. We know that Eliot was deeply grateful to Pound for his revisions of The Wasteland. Pound, in essence, made the published poem what it is. But we also know that Eliot always had his doubts about Pound's poetry. He praises the metrics as well as translations, but on the subject of the cantos, Eliot says as little as possible. Indeed, his correspondence and critical prose, I've just written about this elsewhere, make clear that he never quite approved of Pound's poetics. He didn't like it. And so the dedication is produced in a foreign language in which it sounds as complimentary as it is terse. A moment's thought, however, reveals that il miglior fabbro is also something of a backhanded compliment. In general, then, Eliot's foreign language insertions serve as an important index to a set of convictions and contradictions that might otherwise remain hidden, whether about his regard for Pound's Hebrew or the language of the Hebrew language of the Hebrew as the language of the Jews. French, German, and Dante's Italian were, even after World War I, the languages of European culture. And of course, Latin and Greek, the admired and necessary classics. Sanskrit had an appealing exoticism. Again, the Cumaean Sibyl may address us in Greek, but you will not find the woman in the Hofgarten actually speaking Lithuanian, nor will Philippus the Phoenician utter a word of that other Semitic language. As for the words of the prophet, in the multilingual, multicultural landscape of the wasteland, those words are inscribed in the biblical English everyone would recognize. And, I do think it's been argued that there's a kind of anti-Semitism here. It's slight in a way, it's a slight note, but I think it's certainly there. I mean, to Eliot, it wouldn't even occur to him to use Hebrew, even though he admires the prophet so much. But then English itself has a curious status in the wasteland. Eliot's poem may be said to dramatize the moment when the poet's own language seems to break down as other languages, and hence their cultures, impinge upon it, breaking all norms of consistency or uniformity. In this sense, the Wasteland is indeed a war poem, but change was imminent. After 1922, and of course this deserves a whole essay, Eliot turned away from the language of citation, foreign or otherwise. Ash Wednesday, the Ariel poems, and the four quartets avoid the heterogeneity of multiple languages, opting for a remarkably purified English. Except for Dante's Sovegna Vos, Be Mindful, used in part 4 of Ash Wednesday, recalling the need for purgatorial transformation, there's not a single foreign citation in these later years. Eliot firmly, almost ruthlessly, put the Poundian collage mode behind him and became, for better or worse, the more conceptual Anglo-Catholic, classical, royalist poet of the four quartets. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Marjorie, because your talk really synthesizes and gives new ideas at the same time over preoccupations that we all share with our students, especially at the moment that are working on Eliot. How to deal with his use of foreign languages, how to deal with the French in Eliot's poems. So maybe that's one first question, and then I'm sure there will be other questions from the audience. But my question would have been to know your thoughts about his use of French, and maybe as compared to Pound's use of French, because they're different. But at the same time, well, I'm wondering, I have no specific idea on this.
Well, in French, Eliot was really at home. After all, he wrote lots of French poems, and he really was at home in French. So when he introduced the French everywhere, you have a sense of being very much at home, and that this is going to describe a certain city atmosphere that you can't get otherwise. And that was his first and basic home, would be the French. He had no difficulty with that. The Italian is already one step away, and the only Italian he uses pretty much is either Arno or Dante. I mean, Eliot loved Dante, and so Dante is crucial, and he's always putting in Dante. How the Italians feel about it, I don't quite know. You know, there's a kind of it's perhaps a little mannered, the way the Italian is used, which the French isn't. So, of course, the interesting thing here that you're studying it in French is it is basically French in so many ways. And on the other hand, what isn't French is the sound. And I've often worked with people with Garantion, where I've looked up the French. And I mean, you have this very harsh, knee deep in a salt marsh, heaving a cutlet, bitten by flies, fought. I mean, it's so harsh. Bitten by flies, and you get the verb at the end, fought. Now, I don't remember exactly what the French is, that's in Garantion, but it cannot sound like that. It sounds much softer. What is after such knowledge, what forgiveness in French? Do you remember, Hélène?
No, I don't. Does
Whatever,
anyone
you must
remember?
have it. Somebody must
Do you
have it
have it
there.
in your
Does
books?
anybody have it?
I have it somewhere.
After such knowledge, what forgiveness? These famous lines. So many of the famous lines, to me, don't sound quite right in French. You know, or they have a very different tone. And of course, the tone is going to be very different. And at the same time, Eliot really was at home, and you know, I think. Garantion. I should have brought it in.
So it's page 30, which is page I think maybe it's 10 pages earlier.
Is that the French? Yeah.
I've got problems with my eyes.
Oh,
Not serious, but I can't see it. This is because I'm
all right. Well,
after
you know,
such knowledge, what forgiveness? Think now history has many cunning passages, contrived corridors.
now what is that in French?
That is not in French, that is in English.
Oh, no, but I mean, do you have the French translation?
I don't, oh, Benoit, help. Someone's running with the French translation right now. I
Anyone?
was looking for it in French, but I'm thinking about the poem Dans un restaurant. You know,
Oui.
that is, it doesn't sound, I don't know what the rest of the audience think about it, but it doesn't sound exactly French.
Yeah, I'm sure I know what you mean.
Okay.
what
In French, that is going to be après un tel savoir, quel pardon. Dis-toi bien que l'histoire a maint passage subtil, maint corridor, et issus dérobés qu'elle nous égare, d'ambition chuchotante, nous leurre de vanité. Oui, dis-toi bien, etc.
Yeah, it sounds quite different, doesn't it? Think now. And that beginning, read the beginning, that fifth line, here I am, an old man in a dry month. That part can be translated, waiting for a boy, waiting for rain. I was neither at the hot gates, nor knee deep. There's that amazing line, nor knee deep in a salt marsh. It's about line 5 or so. I should have brought it in.
Yes.
Beginning-
Nor
beginning-
knee deep in a salt marsh heaving a cutlass is ni embourbé dans la saline jusqu'aux genoux, levant un glaive.
Yeah.
There's more of the dental sounds in the English
Yeah.
that make it sort of biting, where the
I
French is
more
softer.
even-handed.
Yeah.
And it makes it rather different. And
That
that's
is Pierre Léris's translation, so we're not going to say anything about it. But it's
whatever it would be. Yeah.
it has a history, and it's a historical time in translation. I'm not sure we would translate exactly the same way today. For instance, has a history has many cunning passages, contrived corridors. He writes que l'histoire a maint passage subtil, maint corridor. Now, maint makes it softer. It's and that's not in the original. It's an addition because Eliot uses many just once, and he uses cunning and contrived, and so that's where the repetition should be.
Yeah, I see. Very interesting. Well, that would be very interesting to study some of those examples. But it did strike me as interesting to see. And with Pound too, why translate one thing and not translate another? And they were obviously so besotted with Arno Daniel, Pois Hascosa nel fuoco che lia fina. They're finding fire. They quote that again and again in their essays. There's a lot of quoting in the essays. But it's so interesting that Pound sort of made the wasteland what it is. And yet, as I say, Eliot did not like the cantos. He kept trying to avoid publishing it in the New Criterion. Eliot Pound would always say, aren't you going to publish my next set of cantos? And Eliot would find a way of getting out of it because he really didn't like it. And he says that from the very beginning. I was shocked to reread that he writes to Conrad Aiken early on. So we're talking about the 20s now, when he first met Pound, and Pound did everything for Eliot. Pound, introduced him to people, his social life. He got Proof Rock published, et cetera, et cetera. Eliot immediately wrote to Conrad Aiken and said, this fellow Eliot is helping me. And that's very nice, something like that. But of course, it goes without saying that his own poetry is sophomoric or something like that. Is merely sophomoric. So Pound was much nicer to him than he was to Pound. And then he wrote to his father. Pound, for those of you who don't know, Pound wrote that amazing letter to Eliot's father explaining why he was allowed to stay in England. Well, it was the war anyway, he couldn't have left, but why it's wonderful for him and he'll become one of the important poets, and you can't become an important poet in America. You just can't do it. America's too primitive and all that. And he sent that letter to Eliot's father, who I think responded in some way. And Eliot was furious. And he wrote his father and he said, I wish he hadn't written you because I'm not close to him at all, after getting him to write.
I'm sure there are questions. Do you have questions for Marjorie? Yes, you do. Yeah. Could someone run for the mic?
Hello.
Let me turn it so you can have
Okay.
others than me?
Yes, thanks so much for this stimulating talk. I'm wondering what you think about the Bollinger.
I can't hear, can't hear.
Yeah, you need to switch it on. Yeah.
Right. Thanks so much for this very stimulating paper. I'm wondering what you think about the Bollinger Prize. I certainly agree with you that, Eliot wasn't very grateful in the beginning, but there was the Bollinger Prize in the end for the piece in Cantos.
Yeah, that's true. Well, by that time, okay, by that time, Pound had been through everything, had been through hell, sort of, and Eliot was sympathetic. I mean, he was an old friend. They had known each other forever. As time went on, Eliot became a little more generous to Pound. And besides, now it wasn't so much being it was the way it was. And he thought, okay, with all its faults, it's probably, the other people all said, the best poem of the year. And I think that was true. Whatever one thought of his politics, the rival would have been William Carlos Williams's Patterson, I think, I'm not sure, but something by Williams. And it's true that the Pound was better. And so, but in his later years, Eliot went to visit him at St. Elizabeth's. Eliot became much more generous. And I think he also felt bad. But as a young man, as a really young man, Eliot was so cutting and could be so nasty. And he was quite hostile, really, about the work. No, this isn't how poetry is written. You can't write poetry this way. The fight being basically, and the fight continues, that Eliot's is a very centered poem, centers on certain themes, threads all the way through, whereas Pound is also, in a way, once you know the work, it's centered, but it's much looser, much more open. A lot of things can be introduced, and he starts on whole new scheme, and so on, so that would not have been really considered poetry. And don't forget, at the time, R.P. Blackmer, the great critic, for instance, said that it was just a rag bag, that the Cantos was just a rag bag. Eliot didn't disagree with that at all. And he wrote to people it was a rag bag, and that was not considered poetry. And that's still true. It's still true. I read recently in the TLS, David Bromwich, notable critic, saying, well, but it is really the Cantos. It's just kind of a mess. It's just a rag bag. So that's the view. But I'm glad you raised that point. On the Bollinger, Eliot was kind. He had come around to feeling very sorry for Pound. He didn't think Pound deserved all that. I mean, after all, Eliot's views weren't so wholly different. And so he did not think that Eliot deserved to be punished as he was punished, even though he won the Bollinger. And so that would be the answer to that. Yeah.
I may take advantage to ask a question. Just a curiosity. You're saying he cites Sanskrit, but he cites it in English writing, right? Instead of using Sanskrit alphabet. So I was wondering, since he uses the Greek alphabet, why doesn't he use the Sanskrit alphabet for the Sanskrit
I thought he
words?
did. I thought he did use the Sanskrit. No.
Well, it's all, Shansi, you read it with the English letters as well as data dayadvam damiata. You don't have the,
Well, I would have thought that was
characters that
too
would be,
obscure. Yeah, otherwise it was too obscure that nobody
it
could
probably
read
would have been very obscure. You're quite right.
Probably would have thought nobody could read it. Whereas Greek, it was taken as a given that everybody knew Greek,
Right.
It was studied. Every, gentleman who did well would have known Greek. But there's a certain show-off quality, I suppose, too, with that. And the Sanskrit, he couldn't do it because nobody would have had a clue. But Sanskrit was studied, and was popular, and was sort of the exotic, as I say, the exotic other in a way. So that could be studied, whereas Hebrew was never the exotic other. But I hear recently at Yale, where this issue came up, that just students did object to it and asked that frequently, why must that be in the King James Bible? Of course,
Yep.
the language of the King James Bible is beautiful. Now, when it comes out in France, in French, how do we know, what difference does that make then? That do we know what Bible, where it comes from? Of course, less so. So it would make less of a difference in reading it. But it is interesting in English the way it has become synonymous with the King James Bible. How does that work in French?
No, we
I'm
don't
not
have
sure.
that same standard sort of 17th century translation that we could use. It's been updated. So
Yeah,
there isn't
Yeah.
that feeling that you get when you get the King James Bible.
interesting. That's interesting. Yeah.
Well, Latin was retained for a very long time as well.
Sure.
But I was thinking about the Sanskrit, and I was wondering whether it wouldn't be connected with the printer's possibilities, because they needed to have the fonts for printing. I'm not sure you could find this easily.
That's a good point.
I'm just sort of,
I
thinking.
don't know, but that's a very good point. They may not have been able to even get it. Yeah. Maybe at certain places at Harvard, but in England at the time during the war,
And,
like-
to print a poem that is only partly not a scholarly book.
right,
I
it-
was wondering.
wartime, it's written during wartime. I mean, it's finally finished later, but just the same, that would have been hard. Would have been very hard. It's very interesting to look at these. I'm always very interested in how things first appear. And I found the other day that the great Russian poem Tango with Cows by Lindsay has been done, and they've redone it in a perfect edition, which is just like the original. But in there, it was originally, that poem was printed in the same issue of, I can't think of the name of the journal now, where there's the first version of Coup de Day. Malame Coup de Day. And when you read the Malame Coup de Day, not in its later version, but just, a little snatch of it, and on the back of this magazine, it's very strange to see and very, very interesting. But I'm curious, can I ask you, Echo, a question? So what is the view of Eliot now in France, would you say?
Uh-huh.
The general-
We
the
just had a minor debate just before your talk. But I'm going to maybe Benoit, because you did a recent translation of the Wasteland into French.
Yes, Benoit, I would love to hear about that.
I'm not sure I know the answer though. I'm saying I think it was a delayed response anyway, that the Wasteland was only translated after he got the Nobel Prize after World War II. And so probably came too late for him to make a real impact. Had it been translated in the 20s, it would have made a much bigger difference, I think. So he had already acquired that image of a sort of classicist and an official poet and a Nobel Prize winner, which failed to turn him into the kind of avant-garde figure he might have had he been translated before. So I think he's kind of respected, but hasn't been really absorbed into any kind of important French scholarship.
Isn't that interesting? What's fascinating in the United States is that now Eliot is once again very popular, but it's hard to know why, since he has all the wrong views, as far as women goes, anti-Semitism, the political views, and yet for some reason, it's because he's a great poet, I guess, people really like him again. And when I say again, don't forget that, say, I don't know if you're studying this, but in the 1980s or so, Cynthia Ozick, a well-known critic, actually wrote, I think in the New Yorker or one of those magazines, that Eliot was finished, that now the great poet was William Carlos Williams, and nobody read Eliot, nobody cared about Eliot, and goodbye, and then his views were so awful, and they are pretty awful in many places, and so on. And for some reason, I gave a talk on Eliot for engineers recently, and they were all crazy about it. They love the way it sounds, and they love proof rock, just the sheer language of it. It is wonderful. And so he's once again, modernists are very popular. Who aren't popular are the poets of the mid-century. The mid-century has sort of vanished, whether it's Robert Lowell or whether it's somebody like Zhukovsky, very little read. But the modern Stevens, Pound, Eliot, Williams to some extent, Marion Moore are once again very popular. Yeah.
Another question.
Marjorie, I had a question about your own scholarship and the way that you turned to Eliot pretty late in your career.
Right,
At the time of the Poetics of Indeterminacy,
right,
Eliot was kind of the counter model, right?
right, right,
Kind of on the side of the new critics, and you
right.
were siding with the, Jerome Rothenberg and all these new voices and the, I guess, John Cage in that book. So that the first chapter you, as far as I know, devoted to Eliot. I mean, in one of your book-length studies was the 21st Century Modernism, the chapter on proofrock, right? And then you had another one in Infrathin, in Unoriginal Genius as well. So I guess my question is, how do you explain that Eliot was eventually featured almost systematically in your last major 3 books? How did that, come about?
I'm glad you asked that. Well, I mean, I could say I just changed my mind. Do I change my mind? Yes, I do. What happened was this: when I first started studying, where Eliot was obviously sort of the poet, and we didn't study Cage at all or any of these people, and I wanted to bring that group in. It all began with John Ashbery. That people made fun of John Ashbery. It doesn't make any sense. And so in order to study these lacustrine cities and the poems that I discuss in the Poetics of Indeterminacy, Eliot became my kind of whipping boy almost. And I really didn't like it that much. I still don't. I have a whole chapter on the 4 quartets, or just 1 quartet in Infrathin, and I still don't really like Eliot. I don't like his ideas, and I don't like the way he treats religion and so forth. But when I was asked to work on Little Gidding, I was asked to speak at Little Gidding. So I thought, okay, let's have an open mind and let's try this. It's just that the sound is so beautiful and the language is so beautifully done that even if you don't quite like the ideas, it became interesting to me. But what happened was this. First of all, even John Ashbery had said to me, "You're wrong. I was very much influenced by Eliot." And that's true. If you go back and read Ashbery, read some of the most important poems, there are many debts to Eliot. Many direct lines are taken from Eliot. So my notion that to like Ashbery is to turn away from Eliot was wrong in a way. And I did it, I kind of overdid it, in that way. And I had on the one side Pound Stevens, whose era, I had Pound on the one side with the right poets, and then Eliot, the wrong poets, and Stevens, I also didn't like very much, and so forth. Now, I think I did that because I felt it was so important to raise up this other group and pay attention to this neglected group of modernists. I still love Cage. I still write on Cage when I can. And the various poets I deal with in Poetics of Indeterminacy, who after all starts with Rimbaud, who I still love. And there's Williams, who I like a little less than I once did. I think he's an important poet, but not always. There are things that are very obvious and too easy, I think. And I think his reputation, no question, that Williams' reputation in America has gone downhill. He's not read nearly as much as he once was. Ditto Robert Creeley and lots of other poets. But what happened to me somehow is that as the years went on, I never wanted to come back to the kind of new critical poets like Anthony Hecht or John Holland or these. I just like them just as much as I ever did. But I think I was wrong about Eliot, and it was just because he's so overpraised that I was negative. And what can I say except that in reading it again, I felt differently, not about all the poetry, but Proofrock was without doubt one of the great poems of any time, I think. And so it's such a pleasure to read it. So I kind of, it's probably not a good thing, but one does change one's mind. And I didn't stay with that original idea. As far as indeterminacy goes, I think my problem there was that Eliot was also had that quality. And he did have that quality. And I tried to differentiate between the Eliotic symbol and the metonymic image of these other poets. Now, that was true up to a point, but you know, it's true that Eliot is a symbolist poet, but in a very interesting way. And so I just changed my mind in introducing Eliot. There are other people I've changed my mind about. You do in the course of a career clearly change your mind. In other words, they're poets in
Marjorie Perloff.
oh, excuse that. They're poets in the Poetics of Indeterminacy and the Dance of the Intellect and stuff that I don't like as much anymore as I once did, that I don't think are important poets, that I've gotten kind of tired of. I probably shouldn't name them, but anyway, that's the way it goes. Well, I'll name one. I'll name one because it's somebody Helene really likes, but that I never liked so much, and that's Jackson McClough. I just never could make very much of Jackson McClough. And I always thought, haha, okay, he has these wonderful devices, but so what in the end? And I once said to John Cage, I don't really get Jackson McClough. I don't know what to do with it. And he said, forget the quality and think about the quantity. It was a wonderful thing to say. Forget the quality and just think about the quantity. It's true. There is so much Jackson McClough, you know. So I loved it when Cage said that, forget the quality, think about it. And I've done that ever since. But so there's a poet that may be very what seems radical, but I just don't think he has very much to say. And as I say, in the course of a career, doesn't this happen to everybody here? You change your mind. And I was quite vociferous in Poetics of Indeterminacy, which is my book people seem to use the most. And I still agree with many of the things there. And I think it was very necessary to bring out John Ashbery. After that, look at how everybody started to love John. I mean, John Ashbery became very popular and still is, I think. And but that took a while. And I remember people like Helen Vendler originally didn't like Ashbery at all. And, you know, thought it was just too crazy. So that's been the issue for years. And then these same issues circle back. And as I say, you find that as you get older, you like different people. I like very different people now. Partly you become a little more conservative. I've sort of gone back to Proust. I could read Proust anytime, all the time. And I think he's the great writer of the century for me, much greater than any of the above mentioned, any of the poets. And I can't you know, at this very moment tell you why, but I really feel that way. So, and that wasn't true before. So you change.
Thank you.